What's going on, guys? My name is Jordan. I'm the head coach here at SaberSim, and I wanted to record this video walking through my NASCAR DFS process, how I use SaberSim's powerful NASCAR sims and lineup building tools to build my lineups each and every week. Now, strategically speaking, I think NASCAR actually has a lot in common with a sport like NFL Showdown, where to take down large field GPPs, you're going to need the optimal lineup or very close to the optimal lineup to win. And a lot of what I'm doing in my process is allowing SaberSim sims to handle identifying and constructing those optimal lineups and adding my value in diversification to make sure I'm playing a well-diversified portfolio of lineups and avoiding duplication. Because you're playing with typically a pretty small driver pool, and a lot of these contests, especially for the Daytona 500, can get pretty large, duplication becomes a problem. We don't want, when we finally identify that optimal and have a high-scoring lineup, for it to be shared with 1,000 other people. So I like to spend some time here trying to figure out how to avoid duplication. So let's go ahead and actually dive right into what my process looks like in the app. So as I mentioned before, because our sims are powered by this robust model that's taking into account individual driver skill, the Vegas odds for a particular week, the intricacies of that week's track and race as a whole, I'm not spending a lot of time doing a lot of research here into these individual drivers and adjusting projections. My process starts with a ownership rule intended to avoid duplication. And for that, I'm going to set a rule limiting how high the geometric mean of the lineup ownership can get. Now, I'm going to link a video in the description of this one that goes deeper into the math behind a geometric mean, but for the purposes of this video here, it's really just a useful equation and tool that you can use to avoid lineups from being very highly duplicated here. And the equation is, it is the total number of expected dupes that you're getting in a lineup, or in this case, the desired dupes, divided by the number of entries that are actually in the contest, or the number of lineups that are in the contest, to the power of 1 divided by the number of players in a lineup. So for DraftKings NASCAR, that would be 6. What's going on, guys? My name is Jordan. I'm the head coach here. There's 6 drivers in a lineup on DraftKings. In terms of why I'm using 10 instead of a number like 1 here, I don't typically want to get super restrictive with this rule. I still want to allow SaberSim to build high upside lineups that have a high probability of being optimal. And when you restrict your lineups for 1 expected dupe or even less, when you're really trying to just say force a unique lineup, it really starts to get very restrictive on the lineups that SaberSim can build, and it actually may even prevent you from building very many lineups in your pool at all. The main purpose of this rule for me is to avoid having lineups that are expected to be extremely highly duped, like 100 dupes, 500 dupes, even 1,000 dupes in the contest. And so I'm going to use a number like 10 here as a base point for this rule. So in terms of actually setting this rule up in the app, I'm going to go over to the lineup rules section on the right here, and I'm going to add a new rule. And this is going to be an aggregate rule. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say my ownership geometric mean is no more than, and then I need to calculate this out here. So I have Google Calculator pulled up here, and I'll enter this again. I had already done it here ahead of time, but we'll do this again here. So it is 10 divided by 107,000. And then I'm going to take this number to the power of 1 divided by 6, and this base point for this rule. So in terms of actually setting this rule up in the app, I'm going to go over to the lineup rules section on the right here, and I'm going to add a new rule. And this is going to be an aggregate rule. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say my ownership geometric mean is no more than, and then I need to calculate this out here. So I have Google Calculator pulled up here, and I'll enter this again. I had already done it here ahead of time, but we'll do this again here. So it is 10 divided by 107,000. And then I'm going to take this number to the power of 1 divided by 6. And this is ultimately the cap of the geometric mean that I want to use in my lineups. One thing to note is that on SaberSim, you always want to represent this as the actual, I guess not a whole number, but you don't want to represent this as the decimal format. Power of 1 divided by 6 section on the right here. And I'm going to add a new rule. And this is going to be an aggregate rule. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say my ownership geometric mean is no more than, and then I need to calculate this out here. So I have Google Calculator pulled up here, and I'll enter this again. I had already done it here ahead of time, but we'll do this again here. So it is is to avoid having lineups that are expected to be extremely highly duped, like 100 dupes, 500 dupes, even 1,000 dupes in a contest. And so I'm going to use a number like 10 here as a base point for this rule. So in terms of actually setting this rule up in the app, I'm going to go over to the lineup rules section on the right here, and I'm going to add a new rule. And this is going to be an aggregate rule. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say my ownership geometric mean is no more than, and then I need to calculate this out here. So I have Google aggregate rule. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say my ownership geometric mean is no more than, and then I need to calculate this out here. So I have Google Calculator pulled up here, and I'll enter this again. I had already done it here ahead of time, but we'll do this again here. So it is 10 divided by 107,000. And then I'm going to take this number to the power of 1 divided by 6. And this is ultimately the cap of the geometric mean that I want to use in my lineups. One thing to note is that on SaberSim, you always want to represent this as the actual, I guess not a whole number, but you don't want to represent this as the decimal format. You're essentially representing this as a percentage here. So in this case, I'm going to put 21.3 here in as my geometric mean. And what this is going to do in the app is it's going to build lineups that each lineup has an expected dupe here of no more than 10. So any lineup in the pool, I'm going to, based on this particular equation, I'm going to assume that these lineups are max going to be duped up to 10 times. So we're going to save that rule here, and now I'm going to go ahead and get my build started. When it comes to the actual build settings themselves, you'll see that basically all of the default settings for virtually all contests for NASCAR are 0, 0, 10. And what this is doing is this is going into our sims for each lineup that you're building here and building a single race optimal for that particular sim. We're taking a single sim out of our thousands of sims here and building the optimal lineup, which is literally what we are trying to do when it comes to taking down these contests. We want the optimal lineup for the way this particular race could play out. So I don't typically make a lot of adjustments when it comes to the build settings. All I'm going to do here is I have 20 lineups in the Millie Maker for tomorrow, so we'll go ahead and set the settings to that particular contest, and I'm going to just set this equal to 20, and now I'm going to go ahead and let this start. Once I'm in a build here, the main things I'm focusing on are diversification. Now, the main tool I like to use that is the min uniques players up here, which is going to control how many players in your lineup must be different from one another when comparing any given lineup to the other lineups in your set. So by default, this is set at 1, but I like to get pretty aggressive with min uniques when it comes to NASCAR. And the main reason why is that there's a wide variety of lineups that can be optimal and a wide different variety of constructions that can be optimal for different races here. And you can actually see that in action as you increase min uniques here. So I'm going to increase this to 2 here, and we'll see if that even has any change on my lineups, and it does not. My top 20 lineups out of my pool of 500 here already had at least 2 drivers different from each other across the entire set. But as we increase this, you'll see that last lineup in the pool reaches a little bit further and further into the pool. And you can actually see here why I think diversification is so important in NASCAR. Even forcing 4 unique drivers across each lineup out of my set of 20 here only gets to lineup 215 out of my pool of 500. I like to be pretty aggressive with my min uniques. I would say that in a sport like NASCAR, where it's very easy for a driver's engine to go or for them to get in a wreck and just be wiped out of the race completely, I want to make sure that I'm playing a very diversified pool of lineups. So I will typically increase min uniques as a general heuristic of what I like to use. I will increase it to 1 less than the maximum amount of min uniques I can get in my set. So if we increase this to something like 5, we will see that our lineups has dropped down to 10, which means there's only 10 lineups in the pool that are basically 100% unique from each other in this case. So I might use something like 4 for my min uniques. This is also going to depend a lot on how many lineups you're playing. For this particular example, I'm playing 20 lineups in the Millie Maker tomorrow, so something like 4 might actually be pretty viable here. If I was playing 150, it's much less likely that I'm going to be able to get 4 min uniques across an entire set of 150. Yeah, you can see. So for 150, there's only 43 lineups in my pool of 500 that have 4 min unique players from one another. So I would probably drop this down to maybe 3. Probably, actually, I would play 2 min unique drivers in this particular case, which is 1 less than the maximum that's available for this pool of 500. So I'm setting that equal to 2. The other thing that I'll do is I'll take a look and see that after I've arrived at my min uniques that I like here, let's switch this back to my 20 lineup build. I'll go through and check on my leverage here, my highest and lowest leverage to different drivers in the field. And I just want to make sure that there aren't any extreme outliers here, especially for very low projected, very low salary drivers here that are showing up. The main thing that I'm doing here is protecting against the ownership rule that I set on the home screen. Sometimes if you use a really restrictive rule, like say you try to set that ownership product rule to only have one expected dupe per lineup, you might see that some of these drivers here with a very low ownership projection start showing up in a ton of your lineups. And that's really SaberSim saying, hey, the only way that we can build lineups that are expected to have one dupe or expected to be unique is to give you 90% of, 4% owned BJ Macleo, right? Which is probably something that I don't really want to do. So after I've set my diversification with my min uniques, a lot of times I like to go through and just, again, make sure that there aren't any extreme outliers with my leverage on these different drivers where I am way overexposed in the field on a particular driver. Now, for the SaberSim Pro subscribers out there, since you have the ability with Pro to build up to 5,000 lineups in a pool and create advanced custom metrics that you can then filter on post-build, I would tweak this process just a bit if you have Pro. First thing I would do is that instead of handling duplication up front with a lineup rule, I would use this as a filter post build. And the main reason why is with 5,000 lineups in your pool, you can typically just chop off lineups that don't meet your duplication threshold and still have plenty of lineups to work with. And you have the custom metrics to be able to create filters for things like geometric mean ownership post build. So I'm going to turn that rule off there, and I'm going to run another build here, this time on the exact same settings, but this time I'm going to use a pool size of 5,000. So we'll go ahead and kick this build off. I'm going to give this just a moment to run, and I'll show you how I'd go about setting up that filter in this case to avoid duplication. Now that we've got our 5,000 lineup build here, all we need is a metric to calculate the geometric ownership of each lineup and a filter to filter out lineups that we don't want to play. So first things first, we'll go ahead and just add that metric here. I've actually already got one put in, but we'll delete that so I can just show this process from scratch. So we'll go ahead and add a new metric. I'll give this a name of geomean owned so it's clear to us here. And we can add this in as my ownership geometric mean, and in this case we want the actual value of that here. So we'll save that metric here, and that will pop that up on the lineup card so we can see how highly these lineups are likely to be owned. And you can see actually as a difference from that first build we ran here, this lineup would be expected to have more than 10 dupes in the contest because that geometric ownership is 25.3 here. So now that we have that metric in place, we can just use a filter here. So we'll add a filter, and we're going to say show lineups that have the geometric mean owned, which is the custom metric we added, that is less than 21.7. We'll go ahead and save this here, and we can see the effect that that has on this build. So this is taking 5,000 race optimals here and filtering out 984 of them that are expected to be duped more than 10 times in this particular contest. When it comes to the SaberSim Pro plan here, because you're working from lineups that are already optimals for single sim outcomes, I actually am willing to get a little bit more aggressive with the way that I set this filter because I have so many lineups to work with here. So I might go back here and at least explore what would it look like if I filtered out lineups that were expected to be duplicated at all in this build, and maybe try something like a ownership filter of, let's see, so we'll use 1 divided by 107,000 to the 1/6 power, so that's 14.5. So let's go back to our build here now and just see. Sometimes you have to just see what the impact of this is on your build here. So in this case, dropping the ownership to 14.5, which is basically filtering out all lineups except for those that we expect to be unique, filters out the vast majority of our pool. What this is now doing, as you'll see here, is this is going to start pushing those lineups to the top. That 75% BJ McLeod, 35% Cody Ware, just some of these just not very good drivers, low salary guys here, where you're really just counting on them to have a high upside outcome for this unique lineup. When you're eliminating more than, I would say, half or so of your pool, to me that's a sign that you're probably being too aggressive with the rule. So I might go back now here and see what happens if I do 5 or less dupes, and we'll try this here. So that's 18.9 instead. We'll just say 19 there. And see the impact that that has on our build here. And that might be a little bit more of a healthy medium where we're eliminating maybe the top half or so, the most likely to be duplicated lineups in our pool, still leaving us with a big pool from which to work from. So in this case, then I would go back in and experiment with adjusting the min uniques up and seeing the impact that that has on my lineups and see how far down into my pool I'm going. So let's take a quick look. So this does reach pretty far into my pool here. I'm at lineup 1300 out of 2800 or so that are left. I actually still feel pretty good about this. So I now have a well-diversified pool of lineups where each lineup is expected to be duped 5 or less times from my initial pool of 5,000. So whether you're using SaberSim Standard or SaberSim Pro, again, most of what my process is designed to do here is build lineups that are optimals for single race sims, which the simulations themselves handle a lot of here, and then focus my efforts on making my lineups diversified and have a low probability of being duplicated or heavily duplicated in my contest. So if this was my final set of lineups that I was going to take with me into the contest, the last step here is to just fill these and upload to DraftKings. So I'll use SaberSim's entry editor to do that. So I'm just going to click fill entries and grab my file from DK here. We'll get my 20 entries for the Millie Maker loaded up here, and I'm going to just fill those. And then down here, click download and open DraftKings to download that new entries file and get that uploaded straight to DK. So I hope this was a helpful video for you guys out there. If you have any questions for me, feel free to reach out at support@sabersim.com or just post in the SaberSim Discord. I hope you all enjoy the Daytona 500 tomorrow and the rest of the NASCAR DFS season. And in the meantime, thank you all for watching and good luck. What's going on, guys? My name's Jordan. I'm the head coach here at SaberSim, and in this video today, I want to talk about diversification in DFS. It's a term that gets thrown around a lot when you're reading different articles or tutorials or listening to other content, but I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what diversification is, why it's important, and I think there's a lot of things that other tools just frankly get wrong about the best way to diversify your lineups. It's a strong suit of SaberSim. I think our way of approaching lineup diversification is unique and really effective, so that's everything I want to break down in this video today. Let's go ahead and just jump right in. But before that, I want to give a quick shout out to Shady Advice in our Discord community. Shady Advice is always in there pretty much every day helping players become a better DFS player, and he has a lot of really eloquent and articulate thoughts on lineup diversity in DFS. I'm borrowing some of his language that he's used to explain some of these concepts in this video, and before we jump in, I just wanted to give him some credit. If you're not already a part of our Discord server, there's a link to join in the description of this video, and I highly recommend joining and becoming a part of the conversation there. Now, let's start with why diversification is important. Now, first things first, when you're thinking about how to diversify your lineup portfolio, one of the things that you have to internalize is that there is a huge number of profitable lineups that can be played for most slates in most sports. Now, for something like a small MMA card, like an 8-fight card, versus a 10-game NBA slate like we have tonight, there's going to be a discrepancy between how many good lineups there are. But it is a relic of an old way of thinking about DFS that the number of profitable lineups that can be played on a slate is small, that you need to build a core and then rotate as many players around that. There's typically profitable lineups here that can be built using combinations of virtually any players on the slate within reason, and it's important when you start thinking about how you're going to diversify your lineups to understand and internalize the fact that there are a huge number of profitable lineups that can be played. And on a practical level, one of the main values of diversifying your lineup pool is that you're going to get a more even return or a more even set of results each time you play a slate. If you are playing a very concentrated pool of lineups, your lineups are all going to finish in around the same area on the standings, which means it's very likely when you look at these payout structures of how a lot of these GPPs are structured, where you're talking about, sometimes 20-30% at first, only the top 20% of the contest getting paid out. Most of the time what's going to happen if you're playing a very concentrated pool of lineups is you're just going to break the slate completely. Now,
Obviously, when we're playing GPPs, we're not really concerned about the losing nights. We're concerned about maximizing our return on the winning nights. But bankroll maintenance is important. And if you're already following something like the SaberSim DFS profit plan, you know that the more money in your bankroll, the more you're going to be able to continue to play and give yourself shots on goal the next night and the next night and the next night. And if we can play a set of diversified lineups without sacrificing much EV of those lineups, then it makes sense to do so that we can win some of our money back to make sure that we're getting as strong and as effective shots on goal each time we're playing DFS. Now, at this point, you might be saying, okay, I get that, I understand that, but what about when it does hit, right? What if we're playing 20 or 150 or even just 3 lineups that are all very similar and shooting for that slate outcome where we're right, where our core hits and a lot of our lineups are finishing in the payout positions and maybe in the top 1% of the contest? The problem with that is when you play a lot of lineups that are similar to one another in the same contest, they start to cannibalize each other's EV. EV is expected value. It is the probability of a lineup finishing in each of the payout positions for a contest times what you win when you finish in one of those positions. But the problem is that there's opportunity cost for each of these different positions. In other words, only one lineup can win first in a contest. And even if it's duped or if it scores the same as another different unique lineup, those lineups are sharing the prizes for first and second. When you're playing a portfolio of lineups that is all very similar to one another, they start to take away, one lineup takes away from the probability of another lineup finishing in first. Another way of looking at this here is when you are right playing, let's say, 150 very similar lineups to one another, you are not getting paid off enough for what you had to stake to play those 150 very similar lineups for all the times you're playing that portfolio of lineups where it fails, none of the lineups cash, or you have a very heavy losing night. And then this is where it kind of wraps back around to my first point here of knowing that there are a wide variety and a very large number of profitable lineups that can be played. Ultimately, our goal should be to balance EV of each lineup in our portfolio while making that portfolio of lineups that we're playing into a contest as diversified as possible. Now, this is going to depend a little bit on different sports and contests you're playing and how many profitable lineups can be made.
No, I'm just playing
but
online.
For most classic, larger slate type formats, you can basically sacrifice negligible EV or almost no EV and play an extremely diversified portfolio of lineups just because of how many lineups are available for that particular slate. And that's where the process comes in here, which we'll go ahead and get into in a second. But before we jump into that there, I do want to talk about where other tools get this wrong. Diversification is not a SaberSim exclusive concept. There are a lot of other optimizers that understand that players want to do this. They don't want to play perfectly, very heavily concentrated lineups, and there are tools in other traditional optimizers that allow you to do that. But there are problems with it. And the main problems here is that these tools affect the inputs to the lineup building process rather than just using these tools to sort your portfolio of lineups after you've already built great lineups. So I'm talking about things like randomness and min uniques on other traditional optimizers. So let's talk about min uniques first. When you're using any other optimizer out there, min uniques is something you set as a build setting, and in fact on SaberSim that's how it used to work. The problem with this is that affects the way that the lineups are built. Instead of saying build me a great set of lineups and allow me to diversify that portfolio of lineups afterwards, it is affecting the way lineups can be built. After lineups 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are built, the way the 6th lineup is built depends on what those other 5 lineups already are, because it must have, say, 3 different players from each of those original 5. It limits the ability to find all of the different profitable lineups that you can play on a slate and all of the different angles you can take, and it actually affects the lineup construction. You might end up with unnecessarily lower projected lineups in your pool because of your min unique setting, where there were other lineups that you could have already played that just didn't get built because of that setting ahead of time. Randomness actually has a similar problem there. because it is affecting player projections ahead of time before you start building lineups. If you set randomness to some arbitrary setting, it's creating a distribution for a player, which we'll also talk about some of the problems with that in a second here, but it's affecting the player projections. You may set a randomness setting implying a certain amount of diversity in your lineup pool, but as a result of that, you are getting lineups that are far lower projected than they need to be to reach some arbitrary player exposure threshold or something like that. Randomness also has some other problems here in that it is creating a fake distribution for players that is also not correlated. Randomness on virtually every other optimizer out there is giving players a normal distribution, and those distributions are not correlated. We know that most players in a lot of different sports don't actually have normal distributions. You can go ahead and look at basically anything. NBA actually is a pretty normally distributed sport, but you can look at something like MMA and see very quickly that most fighters do not have a normal distribution. Golf is another perfect example where golfers are very much not normally distributed. Baseball and football as well as hockey. The majority of player projections and athlete performance in general does not have a normal distribution. But probably even worse than that, those normal distributions that come out of randomness are not correlated to one another. They're not taking the other players that are playing in that game into account. If, let's say you're using normal distributions for a football slate, and in your normal distribution that is given to Patrick Mahomes, he has a upside scoring game. That does not affect the projection that is selected for Travis Kelce, even though in theory, in the games that Patrick Mahomes is having that upside game, Travis Kelce is likely also probably performing well, or in a lot of those outcomes he's going to be, because those players are positively correlated. Randomness doesn't really understand any of that. So the two real problems here with other tools and the way they try to handle diversification is that they affect the way that lineups are built themselves, because they are changing the inputs to the system in a way that affects lineup construction and is inaccurate, and randomness in particular does not use real distributions, and the distributions selected or the outcomes selected are not correlated. So let's talk about what happens then in SaberSim that is so much better, and some ways that you can actually make your lineup sets diverse here. So the first thing is that instead of using something like randomness, we use sim diversity. And our ability to do this comes from the fact that we are simulating games out on the slate thousands of times using a play-by-play sim. So we can actually go through and come up with the true range of outcomes for a player based on actual individual game simulations. Our sim diversity slider does diversify your lineups, but it does so by pulling from those true actual game sims.
Uncle, that's what it's supposed to be the name of the character.
Because one, we're using the real distribution that that player actually has on the slate, pulling from individual smaller subsets of game outcomes to create that diversity in your lineups. But those game outcomes also have natural correlation baked into them. I think NFL, again, is a good example here. When you're looking at a player like Patrick Mahomes, you're not just saying, in this lineup I'm building, if his average projection is 22, he's going to have a projection of 30 for this lineup. You're saying, I'm going to use a game simulation where he actually scored 30 points, and the other players playing in that same game are going to have their projections come from that exact same game. So you're naturally getting these game scripts in there as you are diversifying your lineups. Sim diversity, honestly, is going to do a fantastic job alone of diversifying your portfolio of lineups because it's pulling from the real range of outcomes of players in a way that is naturally correlated. Now, it goes one step further as well because we also have a better alternative to min-uniques. We have a min-uniques player option when you're actually in a build here, which will control how many players must be different when comparing each lineup in your set against other lineups in the set. So when I'm referring to a lineup set, I'm talking about this number here. Right now, each lineup in our set of 20 must have one player different. That's the default to make sure that you're playing at least a unique lineup into each of your entries here. But you can increase this here and make it so each lineup in your set of 20 must have 2 players different, or 3 players different, or 4 players different. Now, this is the same way min-uniques works on other tools, but it's in a different spot of the process, and that's what's really important here. Min-uniques comes after the lineups have been built on SaberSim, which means it doesn't affect the quality of the lineups being produced in the first place. When I ran this build here, and I'm building 536 total lineups to ultimately enter into a 20 max type contest, these 536 lineups were not influenced by the lineup that came before it. That's really the big problem with min-uniques on other tools, and it gets worse and worse the more lineups you're building. Imagine how restrictive min unique set at 3, for example, is on the 536th lineup in your pool, when it now has to be 3 players different from 535 other lineups that came before it that you're never even going to play. We just want to make sure that once we're selecting the top lineups we want to take with us into our contest, they are as diversified as possible. So let's talk about actually how I end up using these. So this is going to be a general rule of thumb. It's going to be a heuristic. I think it does a good job of balancing EV and diversity like I was talking about before. Typically, I like to get an idea of how unique could I get for the number of lineups I need out of my pool for this set. And you can do that by just basically cranking this up and seeing where do you get to the point where we can't find 20 lineups that match your diversity settings. So let's go ahead and just for the sake of example here, crank this up to something like 6. Okay, so 6 actually is still doable here. We are finding 20 lineups from our pool of 536 that have 6 players different from one another. And that should go to show you what I was saying before about there are a wide variety of profitable lineups that can generally be played on most slates, especially a 10-game slate. Let's crank this up to 7 instead and see what happens. Once we get to 7, our lineup set drops down to 10 here, which is Saberson telling us there are only 10 lineups in our pool of 536 that are at least 7 players different from one another. So my rule of thumb that I typically like to use is figure out where the maximum value is that I can get where I'm still getting the correct number of lineups out, and set min uniques to 1 less than that. I don't necessarily want to play the maximum number of min unique players I can play on a slate, because I want to balance EV, I want to still be playing strong lineups, so I'm going to play 1 less min unique here than what the maximum value is. And we can actually kind of test this out here. So we have 5 unique players in our pool, 5 unique players in our lineup set of 20 from our pool of 536. And let's go down and look and see what that last lineup is in our pool. So in this case, our last lineup is lineup rank 171, ranked by Saber Score, which is intended to essentially quantify lineup EV here. And that's still a pretty solid lineup here. It is in at least the top half, really the top third of lineups sorted by our pool, 536, and we're getting great diversity. We know that each lineup we're playing in our set has 5 out of 8 players different from one another. These lineups, if I were to enter them into a contest tonight, would probably have a pretty wide spread of results here, because the lineups themselves are so different from one another. If one is failing, it is really, it's not one of a kind. It is not a perfectly unique lineup. It does not have 8 min uniques from other lineups in the set, but there are not many lineups like it. We're playing great lineups that have win equity, that have are positive EV in the contest we're playing, but are different enough from one another so they're not cannibalizing EV, and we're getting a more even set of results across our portfolio. Now, a couple other things I wanted to mention on this point of diversification here. I think another common misconception about diversification is that this happens at the player level. The best way to diversify your lineups is to make sure that you're not playing more than X amount of a player. And that can be something done based on the ownership projection, based on your own metric, based on an arbitrary number depending on the sport or the slate size. And player exposures can be a decent way to manage risk, but they're not necessarily a great way to diversify your lineups. For example, let's say we go ahead and drop this back down to min uniques equals to 1. And I come over here and I start adjusting player projections here to maybe cap all of my players at 50% as an example. I'm not going to go through and do all of these, but let's say my goal was to get a maximum player exposure of 50%. Now, that does limit some of the risk that I'm taking on with these players. I only have 50% of my lineups with Terry Rozier, for example. So if he does have a bad game, I have another 50% of my lineups in my pool that don't happen. The problem is that this doesn't really attack the problem at the root. It manages risk on individual players, but lineups that have Terry Rozier in it, my 10 that have Terry Rozier in it, may all be very similar to one another. In fact, my lineups that have Terry Rozier may also be very likely to have Mo Wagner and Lauri Markkanen and some of these other players, where all of my lineups that don't have Terry Rozier may also be very likely to have the same set of players in those lineups. That would diversify us somewhat, but it doesn't necessarily solve the problem of making sure that our portfolio is as diversified as possible while balancing EV. And I think player exposures, again, get close to the problem, and they can be a decent way to limit your risk in a particular situation, but it's not the best way to actually think about diversification. Diversification really should be at the lineup level and not at the player level. The main situation where I do think limiting risk with player exposures can be helpful is if there is additional risk associated with that player due to the conditions of that game. Players that are questionable, or potentially MLB players playing in a game with postponement risk, or maybe situations around the trade deadline or where teams' rotations have changed recently. If you are trying to navigate risk on a particular player, I think it's perfectly fine to use player exposures. Maybe you're looking at a slate like this tonight and thinking, I don't even want to take on the unnecessary risk of a guy like Paul George who's questionable. Eliminating that player to limit the risk you're taking on in your lineups is fine. Capping player exposures to diversify your lineups probably is not having the impact you might think it does. One other thing to think about when you're messing with min uniques here to diversify your lineups is the dynamics of that particular slate and sport. Now, we're going to be able to get much more diversified in a sport like NBA on a 10-game slate than we can in something like MMA. You should be aware of the fact and comfortable with the fact that as there are more profitable lineups available to you on the slate, you're naturally going to be diversify further with min uniques. There are certain MMA slates or even NFL showdown slates where using min uniques equal to 1 might actually be the optimal way to play the slate because there are not enough profitable lineups that can be played while diversifying your lineups further. I think in a lot of classic sports where you're talking about NBA, MLB, NHL, NFL main slates, there are an enormous number of profitable lineups and your min uniques can get pretty high, but you should be aware of the fact that it is going to depend on how big the player pool is and how many effective lineups that you can build. The other thing to note is how correlation plays a role into this. Now for NBA, correlations are very low and they're mostly negative, so you can really adjust min uniques pretty freely in the way that I've described here. However, in a sport like NFL or MLB or NHL, where you are often stacking players together to take advantage of positive correlations, that means that the remaining players that are left available in the lineup is going to be a little bit more limited. For example, you wouldn't necessarily say that you are willing to play Patrick Mahomes with any 7 other players in a DraftKings NFL lineup. When you are playing Patrick Mahomes, most of the time you're going to want to pair him with Travis Kelce or Juju Smith-Schuster or other Chiefs pass catchers, which means there are less combinations when you have a very high number of min uniques that make sense for those Patrick Mahomes stacks. If you are playing in a higher correlation sport, it is worth looking at the impact that increasing min uniques has on your stacks and your actual lineups themselves, and potentially using a little bit of a smaller number to make sure that you are diversifying your Patrick Mahomes stacks lineups as much as possible, but not setting min uniques so high that it is actually breaking up those stacks and forcing more, say, Patrick Mahomes lineups in it that don't have Travis Kelce in the lineup. Now, the last point I wanted to make about diversification here, and I think this is something that people get a little bit backwards sometimes, is that the fewer lineups you're playing, the